such as pandemic advisor Scott Atlas, who pushed a dangerous mass infection strategy that would have further strained our already overcapacity national healthcare system. The strategy that Atlas and others embraced would have pushed already overwhelmed hospital to the brink, led to further delays in care for patients suffering from chronic conditions, and this strategy could have caused an estimated 3 million additional deaths, according to projections by the Washington Post. Look, I'm a doctor, and I took an oath to do no harm. So it's pretty clear to me that we should not reverse course on basic public health measures. We need to defend basic public health in this country due to the politicization and the disinformation and the misinformation that has been putting out there that has caused the mistrust in basic public health knowledge that have been proven time and time again from previous pandemics and basic science to reduce harm and save lives. Why would we willfully want to allow people, even healthy individuals, to get sick by an active infection that we know very little about, that now we know can develop long COVID, even in patients who have been asymptomatic? And the more you get actively infected, the more the risk that you will get long COVID, as per the science. So because the fact of the matter is, while we can now end the public health emergency because of an overall decrease in hospitalizations and mortality, we must still work to address long COVID and emerging variants, especially for high-risk communities, immunocompromised individuals, and unvaccinated populations. And yet, the continued spread of disinformation, meaning purposefully causing confusion, mistrust, and the misinformation, those who aren't willfully, but they're just sharing this disinformation online about not just COVID-19 vaccines, but vaccines overall, pose a serious threat to this work and our ability to protect America's overall health. I'm concerned that people listening to this hearing will then say, well, look, if active immunity is the way to go, hell, I'm gonna go get infected. I don't care about taking precautions. That's not the approach or the message that we should be interpreting from this hearing. So, look, the Brown School of Public Health, Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and Microsoft AI for Health have found a growing distrust in vaccines has caused more than 300,000 preventable COVID-19 deaths. What's more, this dis and misinformation has inflicted serious damage on our efforts to combat diseases that we previously had under control, like polio and measles. So this should be troubling to us all. And I'm not speaking here as a Democrat. I'm speaking here as an emergency physician, a scientist who has taken an oath, and a public health expert that has studied public health and practiced public health in the field, who cares about Republicans and Democrats to stay alive, to stay out of hospitals, to not get infected with an active virus. Even though you may have mild symptoms, you may develop long COVID, you may then carry it and transmit it to somebody who is immunocompromised, who is at high risk of getting hospitalized and dying. So for the sake of public health, for the sake of our neighbors, regardless of political affiliation, I implore everyone here today to remain focused on the facts and come together to identify real solutions that put people over politics to prevent future harm, save future lives, and ensure America is stronger and better prepared in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruiz. Our witnesses today are Dr. Marty McCary. Dr. McCary is the Chief of Islet Transplant Surgery and a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He served in leadership in the World Health Organization Patient Safety Program, elected to the National Academy of Medicine, and has published more than 250 peer-reviewed scientific articles. Dr. Marjorie Smuckenson. Dr. Smuckenson is a research scientist and microscopist with expertise in infectious disease. She received her PhD in biological sciences from Columbia University in 2007 and completed her postdoctoral fellowships at the University of California, San Diego. And Dr. Tina Tan. Dr. Tan is a board-certified pediatric physician, as well as a current professor of pediatric infectious diseases at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago. Pursuant to Committee on Oversight and Accountability Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. The Select Subcommittee, you may be seated. Select Subcommittee certainly appreciates you all for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements and they will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statements to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes has expired and we would ask that you please wrap up. I now recognize Dr. McCary to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Winstrip and Ranking Member Ruiz. You're both good doctors. I respect both of you, even if we have different opinions on some things. You've promoted a very civil discourse here. I believe in civility, so I want to thank both of you. I admire that. Nothing speaks more to the intellectual dishonesty of public health officials than their complete dismissal of the data on natural immunity, making the U.S. an international outlier in this academic dishonesty. Since the Athenian plague of 430 BC, natural immunity has been described. It was protective against subsequent disease during reinfection or prevented reinfection. Natural immunity works for every other virus, with arguably the exception of influenza, because influenza is unique. It's got 2 spike proteins and a very leaky polymerase enzyme. It's unique. Every other virus, practically, that we know of that causes infections in humans. There are 2 viruses that cause severe illness in humans that are coronaviruses besides COVID. COVID is one of 3 coronaviruses that causes severe illness in humans. The other 2 both have long-lasting natural immunity. So it's very bizarre that public health officials bet that this would break the rule. COVID would be different. The CDC tells you, Dr. Ruiz, you mentioned you believe in vaccines, they're safe and effective. I do too, but I don't recommend the chickenpox the chickenpox vaccine if you had chickenpox. CDC doesn't either.
Virus than COVID-19. It's a different virus than COVID-19.
Let him finish his statement.
I don't recommend the chickenpox vaccine if you had chickenpox, nor does the CDC. Same with many other viruses. Over the last 3 years, there have been 200 studies of natural immunity. The Lancet review of 65 studies from 9 countries concluded that natural immunity is at least as effective. The data are clear. The evidence was there all along, but health officials never talked about it. Maybe because the real story is they were worried somebody might try to get natural immunity. So let's not be honest with the public. Was that the idea? Public health officials and people at the government, CDC, NIH, privately told me that's what their concern was about acknowledging natural immunity. So they made ignoring natural immunity a political badge. They dismissed it, saying there was uncertainty. We don't know how long it's going to last, as if we knew how long vaccinated immunity would last. They had it backwards, actually. Our Johns Hopkins study published in JAMA was the 3rd most discussed study of all JAMA publications in 2022, according to the JAMA website. We found antibodies present up to 2 years later. We can have our opinions, but let's not ignore this mountain of evidence. Big Tech censored my study when I posted it, calling it vaccine-hesitant content. Government doctors were privately saying, we agree, but we don't talk about it. We had this sort of intense paternalism. We saw this when Women wanted home pregnancy tests, and doctors were pushing for it, and the medical elite said, no, women can't handle that information at home. We can't have home pregnancy tests. They fought it for years. Same with home HIV tests, medical paternalism. Universities, like my own, put their head in the sand, ignoring the data, forcing young, healthy male students to choose between the risk of myocarditis, 1 in 6,000 young males, or getting kicked out of school, even though they had natural immunity. That was common. The media parroted whatever Fauci and the CDC fed them, just like government officials. When they fed the media, there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Whatever government leaders told them, they parroted without asking any questions. And is anyone surprised that Pfizer or Moderna, which controlled a lot of the narrative, they never talked about natural immunity? Why would they? A reason not to get one of their products? Many practicing doctors knew about natural immunity, the power of it. European doctors, many tailored vaccine recommendations, factoring in natural immunity just like you do with chickenpox. And they would tailor medications, and that's the art of medicine. Now, natural immunity is not just an academic point. Lives were lost because they were ignored it. Thousands of Americans died because public health officials ignored natural immunity. Because from December 2020 and April 2021, there was a limited vaccine supply. Thousands of Americans were dying, just as you said, Ranking Member Ruiz. We had people dying to get the vaccine. The vaccine was highly effective against the variant at that time. It saved lives, and they couldn't get it because we were giving vaccines to those already immune with natural immunity. Why would you give 2 life preservers when some were drowning with none? If you think healthcare costs too much, we're dealing with a massive nurse exodus resulting in higher prices. 34,000 nurses left in New York State alone. Now they're hiring traveling nurses for 2 and 3 times the cost. That's translating into higher medical bills. If you're healthy enough to fight in a war, you're probably extremely low risk for COVID. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Dr. Smuckenson for 5 minutes of remarks. Thank you.
Chairman Wenstrup, Ranking Member Ruiz, and committee members, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm a research scientist with 24 years of experience working in the laboratory, primarily focusing on host pathogen interactions and infectious diseases. Currently, I'm a staff scientist in the Research Technologies branch at NIAID, where I perform collaborative research with investigators throughout the Institute on projects that focus on infectious diseases, rare and autoimmune diseases, and immunology. As a disclaimer, I am here in my personal capacity and not speaking on behalf of the NIH, NIAID, HHS, or the federal government. The U.S. COVID pandemic response has been plagued by a failure to adjust to emerging data and to account for unintended consequences. One glaring example of this is the handling of school closures, with the CDC guidelines continuously at odds with evidence from other countries and from school districts that opened in the U.S. in the fall of 2020. This disregard for data led to prolonged closures and a catastrophic decline in academic achievement and a widening equity gap. This was not the only area where our health agencies failed to acknowledge evidence. They also failed to recognize the protection against COVID afforded by natural immunity. Natural immunity refers to the immunological response that an individual develops after recovering from an infection. It is part of the adaptive immune response, which produces memory B and T cells that remain in the body and can quickly respond to the same pathogen if it's encountered again. For centuries, natural immunity has been recognized as a vital defense mechanism against reinfection long before the precise cellular mechanisms were understood. Throughout much of the pandemic, though, messaging in the US was that there was no evidence of lasting protection from COVID infection. But in fact, we did know otherwise and early on. In July of 2020, a paper published in Nature showed a strong T-cell response in SARS-CoV-2 recovered patients. It also demonstrated that patients recovered from SARS, the first one, also had T-cells that were still reactive to the virus nearly 20 years later, a very good indicator that SARS-CoV-2 immunity would be similarly durable. Several more papers came out in late 2020, early 2021, reaffirming these results and that even a mild or asymptomatic infection could produce a strong and long-lasting response. As expected, these immunological data translated into low reinfection rates. In February of 2021, a U.S. study of 3 million people showed a 0.3% reinfection rate compared to 3% in those without prior infection during the same time period. 2 months later, the large Siren study of English healthcare workers estimated that prior infection was associated with an 84% lower risk of reinfection. By late 2021, there were numerous studies, including a systematic review, which showed that natural immunity was at least as effective as vaccine-conferred immunity and waned more slowly. The early data clearly showed that natural immunity was strong. Other countries did acknowledge this by allowing exemptions from mandates and passports, while the U.S. continued to disregard it. In the short term, this provided justification for mandates with no exceptions, an approach that resulted in staffing shortages, particularly in the healthcare sector, where we could least afford to lose workers. It also caused needless loss of life as vaccines were given to essential workers with natural immunity instead of being prioritized for the elderly. Additionally, the daily quarantine of thousands of students could have been significantly reduced if districts had at least made exceptions for students with natural immunity, at least. Disregarding the wealth of evidence of natural immunity led to missed opportunities to implement policies that could have been more effective and efficient in controlling the pandemic and limiting collateral damage. Unfortunately, now, vaccination rates for other vaccines have declined, ironically increasing society's vulnerability to infectious outbreaks. While some of this may be due to missed medical appointments and school closures, there has also been a significant loss of trust in public health due to misleading messaging and inflexible policies during the pandemic. Our health agencies must learn from this unfortunate error of failing to be candid with the American public and for the pervasive implementation of policies that were not adequately supported by data. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I now recognize Dr. Ten to give an opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Winthrop, Ranking Member Ruiz, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding today's hearing and inviting me to testify. As a pediatric infectious diseases physician, I have cared for many patients with serious illness due to COVID-19, and I'm committed to saving lives and providing my patients with the best care possible and the best medical advice. And that's why I recommend that all eligible individuals stay up to date on their COVID-19 vaccinations. I greatly appreciate your commitment to hearing from physicians like myself who have been on the front lines of this pandemic since the pandemic started. When SARS-CoV-2 first emerged, it truly was a novel virus, so we knew very little about it. Increasing knowledge, the emergence of new variants, new tools, and increased population immunity have all caused medical recommendations to change appropriately over time. My testimony will cover what we now know about the benefits and risk associated with immunity after infection and COVID-19 vaccines, the appropriate roles of physicians and the federal government in COVID-19 prevention, and recommendations to improve public understanding of vaccines. Now, the term natural immunity to mean immunity after infection can be somewhat confusing. Immunity acquired from a COVID-19 infection and immunity after vaccination are both natural. Immunity after infection appears to provide protection against future severe disease from COVID-19. The body of evidence for immunity after infection, however, is more limited than that for vaccine-induced immunity. And data suggests that the best immunity comes from hybrid immunity, which is a combination of vaccination and immunity after infection. Relying only on immunity after infection to prevent COVID-19 can be very risky. Unvaccinated individuals without prior COVID-19 infection have an increased risk of severe disease, hospitalization, and death. Before vaccines, patients with COVID-19 completely overwhelmed hospitals, which compromised our ability to provide care to all patients. COVID-19 vaccines provide substantial protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. The bivalent booster COVID-19 vaccines increases protection, and we must encourage more people to receive this booster. An April 2022 study found the vaccine effectiveness of the bivalent mRNA vaccine booster was 72% for COVID-19 related hospitalizations and 68% for COVID-19 related deaths. Several studies have also indicated that COVID-19 vaccination appears to reduce the risk of long COVID. A March 2023 study found that vaccinated individuals had less than half the risk of developing long COVID. COVID-19 vaccines are safe, and side effects after a COVID-19 vaccination tend to be mild and temporary, very similar to those experienced after routine vaccination. And we know that CDC has conducted extensive monitoring of the adverse events associated with vaccines, and the risks associated with getting a natural COVID infection are far greater than the risks associated with receiving a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, we know that physicians are considered one of the most trusted vaccine messengers, and a 2021 AMA survey showed more than 96% of U.S. physicians had been fully vaccinated for COVID-19. And as an ID specialist, I've educated other physicians and healthcare personnel about COVID-19 disease and COVID-19 vaccines. We must better leverage the role of physicians to increase vaccine uptake for COVID-19 and other vaccine-preventable diseases. And to do this, we must expand our physician workforce. Unfortunately, nearly 80% of the counties here in the United States do not have a single infectious disease physician. And in 2022, only 56% of adult ID training programs and only 46% of pediatric ID training programs filled. And high medical student debt draws many physicians to more lucrative specialties and subspecialties. The federal government has an important role to play in COVID-19 vaccination, and those roles have evolved over time. The federal government provided critical resources, information, and partnerships to support rapid, equitable vaccine administration. It also instituted vaccination requirements. And the concept of vaccine requirements is not new. We know that seasonal influenza vaccination requirements for healthcare personnel have been in place at many institutions for years and really have decreased the amount of transmission occurring from healthcare personnel to the patients they care for. Prior to the Delta variant, COVID-19 vaccine offered incredibly powerful protection against infection. Reducing transmission could limit the development of variants, ease pressure on hospitals, and save lives. The trajectory of the pandemic, however, has changed. While vaccines remain highly effective at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death, they are no longer as effective in preventing infection and transmission. And in addition, most people in the U.S. now have some immunity. Policies should evolve based on the latest data, and data do not support mandatory COVID-19 vaccination requirements at this time. The other thing that I just want to mention is that routine childhood vaccination rates significantly dropped during the pandemic and remain below pre-pandemic levels. And this is driving outbreaks of diseases such as measles, pertussis, and polio with very troubling public health consequences and economic costs. I thank you for your attention to the important issue of vaccination and this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Doctor. And I agree with the grave concern about the other vaccines that aren't being administered out of fear at this time. You know, I now recognize myself for questions, but I do want to say some things, you know, to imply that those that support the idea of studying and considering and researching natural immunity implies that you're against the vaccine. That's false. That should not be implied. And it doesn't mean that the vaccines weren't beneficial and weren't life-saving. And the emergency use authorization, I felt, was very appropriate, especially for the most vulnerable because of what we knew at the time. But since vaccinated people still got COVID, and we knew that from the trials, you can't say that vaccinated people won't get long COVID because they can still get COVID. And to say that the vaccines are safe is safe as we know it at the time, but we don't have a 5-year study. We don't have a 10-year study. We saw 18 to 40-year-old males getting myocarditis after vaccination. Those are things we need to continue to study and to consider. To make a blanket statement that they're safe is not fair, safe as we may know it at a certain point, but we are seeing things, and we will be looking at, in this committee, we will be looking at our VAERS system, the reporting of adverse events from vaccines. It's important that we do that and make sure that it's working, and it's to be honest, and it's to be trusted. So what we have seen throughout the pandemic is the public health establishment disregarding natural immunity. I mean, that's been very clear. We've all lived through that. Let me go down the line, starting with Dr. McCary's natural immunity to COVID-19, a real thing that should have been considered, recognized, and studied.
Absolutely. We lost 1 million people from the workforce, roughly, because natural immunity was ignored. 1 million people leaving the workforce is not good for public health.
Doctor?
Yes, I think when it came to mandates, we should have absolutely made exemptions for people with natural immunity to save the workforce and to save our precious vaccines for those that were truly vulnerable, which is what many other developed countries did.
Do you think mandates should have been implemented without a consultation with the physician?
I think that mandates, when there is a public health benefit, can be justified. So early on when the vaccines were rolled out, when they did seem to reduce spread, they were justified. But exemptions should have always existed for those with natural immunity.
Then to that point, I will tell you that during the Trump administration, I made the recommendation that America needs to be hearing from the doctors that are treating COVID patients, not politicians. And that would be much more greatly embraced by the American people. Dr. Tan?
Thank you. I agree that you get natural immunity after infection, and I think that's important, but I think early on we did not understand or have the data to really support that, natural immunity would be the only thing to rely on. And we knew that as individuals got COVID infection, they were at much higher risk for going on to developing complications, now known as long COVID and multi-system inflammatory syndrome, both in children and adults.
I think we all agree that early on, no one knew exactly what, so we were all clamoring for a vaccine, but at the same time, should have been looking at natural immunity as well and take it into consideration in the overall treatment of a patient, as I pointed out with my own numbers there. In the summer of 2021, the CDC removed all references to natural immunity. Dr. McCary, do you know why?
They never talked about it. They upheld something I call the Novak Djokovic doctrine. That is, no one who is unvaccinated, regardless of prior recovery from COVID, was allowed in the United States under the false pretense that vaccines prevent transmission, that natural immunity was not a real thing, and that there was no risk whatsoever to the vaccine. And just a quick note, I don't like the conversation framed around all or nothing, entirely relying on natural immunity. Doctors custom tailor treatments all the time. And you know what? If somebody had natural immunity early on, maybe we recommend one dose or space out the doses or hold off on the booster. But this all or nothing cult around vaccine ignores the Freeman study that found that 1 in 662 doses results in a severe adverse event. Do doctors do an improper informed consent with that risk? In the early days of COVID, when we're losing 1,000 people, that risk is acceptable. Now, it's not acceptable. We can't have a 5-year-old girl get 77 mRNA doses in her average lifespan. That's what people are promoting without any data.
I had a situation where a gentleman called me about his son, and he said to go to school he has to get vaccinated. He's a perfectly healthy son, and I recommended 1 dose of the Pfizer. It will give him some immunity, and most of the myocarditis incidents were coming after the 2nd dose. So get 1 dose, get some immunity that way, which the majority of it comes from that 1st dose. Yet he was denied. He was denied accepting that. I said, get a doctor's note. School board was deciding this, not the patient and the doctor. The CDC website at that time, Dr. McCary also said, get vaccinated regardless of whether you already had COVID-19. Studies have shown that vaccination provides a strong boost in protection in people who have recovered from COVID-19. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the CDC's own data showed that if you were vaccinated and had prior immunity, that is the so-called hybrid immunity, or you just had natural immunity, you hit the same ceiling of hospitalization rates during the Omicron wave. So 1 dose may be reasonable, but we fired 81,000 soldiers just in one swath for not having both doses. That is arrogance, paternalism, and medical elitism. That is not the humility the American public expects. That's why child vaccination rates are down, unfortunately.
Any other care to comment on that?
Well, I mean, we know that vaccine hesitancy has existed as long as vaccines have existed. You know, with Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine, there was vaccine hesitancy then. I think with the COVID-19 vaccines, I think there was a misunderstanding in the general public about the role that they would play, at least, you know, in preventing the serious disease and infections and hospitalizations and death that may occur in individuals. And I think that's why it's so important to really protect those individuals, especially those individuals that have immunocompromised conditions. And children do serve as a vector of transmission to those individuals in the household.
If I could, before I turn over to ranking member for questions, you know, I have recommended any chance I get to say this vaccine is different from the other vaccines. And really, this mRNA vaccine has been more of a therapeutic than the other vaccines have proven to be as far as prevention. And I think that people need to know that. And our public health system today should be shouting that from the top of their lungs to parents of young children to make sure they get those other vaccines. But when they say you must get this one as well, I think that's an injustice, and that's harming our system if that's what they're advocating. I yield to the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you. I'm going to put my doctor hat right now. Natural infection creates an immune response in immunocompetent people. We've known that. We've known that for a very long time. Nobody ever denied that. Nobody ever said that getting an infection doesn't create an immune response, okay? The immune response and protection depends on several factors, and varies based on viral load, age, and immunocompetency. So it's not an easy standard response that everybody is going to have. However, natural infection with this virus causes severe illness, hospitalization. With this virus, not the chickenpox, can send you to the ICU. With this virus, natural infection can cause deaths. 3,000 per day, in fact. You know, this virus that mutates and that has an immune response that wanes leads to the need of reboosting your immunity. The goal is to boost your immunity to mount a rapid and strong immune response so that you don't get symptoms, miss work, or transmit it to a high-risk loved ones, or go to the ICU, or, God forbid, die. That's the goal here, people. Just take a step back. Who wants to get sick and miss work? Who wants to transmit this to your little one or your elderly, grandparent, even if you've been vaccinated? So the best way to avoid symptoms from a natural infection or the risk of long COVID or hospitalizations or death is by boosting your immune response passively with a vaccine. Okay? Now, sounds like the narrative being pushed is to get infected with COVID-19. And if you get infected, then you don't need a vaccine, or prefer to get a natural infection over a vaccine for a deadly virus. Or that if you get infected, then disregard the vaccine or the booster. That seems to be the narrative here. That's just wrong, guys. It's just wrong, contrary to medical and public health practice. And it violates the oath of doing no harm. Look, Let me clarify some things. Vaccines don't cause long COVID. Vaccines do not cause long COVID. Natural infection causes long COVID. Okay, active infection, even in mild infections causes long COVID. Let me clear up another misinformation already stated. Yes, vaccines help reduce transmission. They help reduce transmission. It's not 100% you get a vaccine, you're not going to get infected. It's not 100% you get a vaccine, you're not going to spread it somewhere. Again, the immune response boosted by a vaccine hopefully is strong enough, rapid enough to defeat the viral load and how fast it replicates in order to prevent it from reaching a level to where you're symptomatic and you're transmitting it to other people. So with people who have that fast, strong immune response boosted by a vaccine, you're going to be able to prevent getting infected and you're going to be able to prevent transmitting it to other people. Definitely hospitalizations and definitely death. But some people who are vaccinated may have received a larger viral load, a mutated virus, and their immune system may not have responded fast enough, and they still may get infected. They still may transmit it, and they may still be hospitalization. And yes, some may still even die. So it's not a simple black or white, 100% or not. It's understanding physiology and the mechanism of the immune response. So when President Biden took office, he hit the ground running to expand access to life-saving COVID-19 vaccines. On his first full day in office, President Biden issued the National Strategy for the COVID-19 Response and Pandemic Preparedness. The Biden administration's national strategy leveraged the Defense Production Act to rapidly increase our supply of vaccines, stand up vaccination centers in communities across the country, and mobilize the public health workforce to support a comprehensive COVID-19 response. So thanks to President Biden's leadership and investments from Democrats' American Rescue Plan, which every House Republican opposed, we were able to get more than 600 million shots in arms, laying the groundwork to safely reopen 99% of schools, reignite our economy, and resume everyday life. Dr. Tan, as a fellow physician, I deeply admire your commitment to protecting your patients, our nation's kids, from the constantly evolving threat of infectious diseases like COVID-19. How do vaccines work to protect patients and forge stronger immunity, even among those who have already experienced infection?
So as you mentioned, vaccines work by boosting the immunity. And we do know that hybrid immunity actually is one of the strongest immunities in preventing hospitalization, severe COVID disease, and death. It also has been shown that it prevents the development of multi-system inflammatory syndrome, both in children and in adults. And one thing about MISC in children is that many of the children who develop this are unvaccinated, and when they do develop it, many of them either have mild or very little in the way of symptoms, so you cannot predict who's going to go on to develop MISC.
Thank you. Thank you. The Biden administration pursued a multi-pronged approach to encourage uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine and save lives. Alongside decisive action to increase supply and accessibility, the Biden administration instituted common sense requirements for healthcare workers and federal workers to get vaccinated. And as the novel coronavirus evolved, the federal government moved decisively to roll out safe and effective boosters to better protect the American public from new variants. Let me be clear, these actions saved lives. According to a Commonwealth Fund study published in December 2022, the Biden administration's COVID-19 vaccination strategy prevented 3.2 million deaths and 18.5 million hospitalizations. And without COVID-19 vaccines, the United States would have experienced 4.1 times more deaths and 3.8 times more hospitalizations. Dr. Tan, how have vaccines helped us to reduce the ongoing threat posed by COVID-19, particularly in communities that were hardest hit by the pandemic?
So the vaccine also helps to prevent transmission of the disease to other individuals, so that, we know that the more the virus is allowed to circulate in the community, the more it's going to mutate, and the more that individuals are going to become infected.
Thank you. So this is my last question. So, as we look to prevent and prepare for future pandemics, a crucial component of our work must be investing in the infrastructure to rapidly develop and deploy safe and effective vaccines. Look, the decision to concomitantly invest in producing the vaccine while we were in the R&D phase helped us rapidly deploy this. So there are lessons learned that we should incorporate in the next response. And in your written testimony, Dr. Tan, you mentioned the need for investments in vaccine infrastructure, infectious disease physician recruitment, research to better understand and combat vaccine misinformation and disinformation, and increased coverage for vaccines. Dr. Tan, why are these measures so important for our future public health preparedness?
This is incredibly important because these measures will allow us to protect the largest number of individuals so that we don't have another devastating pandemic where you're going to have lives lost when they could have been saved with the use of an effective vaccine. And, by building infrastructure for vaccines in both the adult and the pediatric populations, you're going to be able to save more lives all across the age span.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Comer, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. The pandemic has definitely undermined trust in public health. We've heard time and time again those in positions of public trust in the Biden administration making misleading or false statements regarding COVID-19. Now, I want to run through some of these statements and ask each of our witnesses if at the time those statements were made, if science and data supported these statements. On June 22nd, 2021, Dr. Fauci said, and I quote, "It's as simple as black and white. You're vaccinated, you're safe. You're unvaccinated, you're at risk. Simple as that," unquote. Yes or no, Dr. McCary, did science and data support that statement?
Not anymore.
Dr. Smuckenson?
It did appear like that, but that, in the summer of 2021, it did seem like the vaccines were doing pretty well at suppressing infection and spreading it. But shortly thereafter, it was not. And they didn't look at that in the trials either.
I think at the time, based upon the science that was available, this statement was appropriate. But I think now, the pandemic is evolving, so that we have to be agile enough to really go along with that.
Right. On May 16, 2021, Dr. Fauci said the vaccinated became, quote, a dead end for the virus, unquote. Dr. McCary, did science and data support that statement?
In April of 2021, we knew vaccines did not stop transmission.
Dr. Tan?
It stopped transmission in some individuals, but not 100% stopping.
Dr. Smuckenson?
I agree with what they both said. It didn't.
On May 19, 2021, CDC Director Walensky said, and I quote, "Even if you were to get infected during post-vaccination, that you can't give it to anyone else," end quote. Dr. McCary, did science and data support that statement?
No.
Dr. Smuckenson?
No.
Dr. Tan?
You were less likely, but it's not 100%.
On March 29, 2021, CDC Director Walensky said, quote, "Vaccinated people do not carry the virus. Don't get sick," unquote. Dr. McCary, did science and data support that statement?
It did not.
Dr. Smuckenson?
Again, it may have appeared that way for a while, but the trials did not look at that.
Dr. Tan?
Yes, the trials didn't look at that, so the appearance was yes.
Finally, on June 21st, 2021, President Biden said, and I quote, "If you're vaccinated, you're not going to be hospitalized, you're not going to be in the IC unit, and you're not going to die," end quote. Yes or no, Dr. McCary, did science and data support the president's statement?
We thought that early on, but they denied the overwhelming data that was not true and made that statement after that data were clear.
Dr. Smuckenson?
That was around the time where breakthroughs were happening more rapidly, so I think that we could have seen that was going to devolve into more reinfections.
Dr. Tan?
I think there was some support for that, but, nothing is 100%. So I think science and data at that time was evolving.
Dr. McCary, by July 21st, 2021, were there vaccinated Americans that had caught COVID-19?
Absolutely.
Were there vaccinated Americans in the hospital for COVID-19?
Absolutely.
Were there vaccinated Americans that had died from COVID-19?
Absolutely.
Dr. McCary, was the president lying?
There was a lot of misinformation spread by public health officials that we had to close schools, that vaccinated immunity was much stronger than natural immunity, that the ideal dosing interval was 3 or 4 weeks, that we had to boost young people with no evidence to support it, on long COVID, on ignoring natural immunity. There was a lot of misinformation spread during the pandemic, a lot spread by the CDC.
And I think this is why there's a lack of trust in American public health. Our leaders were unwilling to speak the truth and unwilling to follow the facts. And that's a big deal. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the topic of this hearing. This is a very important hearing. We've got a lot of work to do in America to regain the trust of the American people in public health. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin from Maryland, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start with a small semantic problem. Some people are contrasting natural immunity with vaccination, but actually natural immunity is, natural, and our bodies will create antibodies in response to an infection, whether it's by contracting the disease or in response to receiving a vaccination. So in both cases, natural immunity is operating, and nobody is naturally immune to COVID-19. It creates an implication that somehow some people just will never get it, and I don't think there's any studies that demonstrate that. So if you can activate a natural immunity response, either by getting it or by having a vaccine, why not let COVID-19 just wash over the whole population and create herd immunity? Which seems to be the subtext of some people's remarks here. It'll be cheaper than vaccination, and you don't have to run a government campaign to have people get the disease. They will just get it if you let it run wild. Well, that was precisely the strategy advocated by key Trump advisors during the Trump administration, and I sat on the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis where we dealt with witnesses and people who specifically advocated this. We revealed in a report last year, which I would love to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, called The Atlas Dogma, the Trump administration's embrace of a dangerous and discredited herd immunity via mass infection strategy from June 2022. Then I would ask unanimous consent to accept that report. But the administration embraced this mass infection strategy promoted by pandemic advisor Scott Atlas, a Fox News pundit with no background in infectious diseases, who amazingly was hired by the White House in the middle of the pandemic in July of 2020. So can I just ask for unanimous consent to enter this report into the record?
So ordered.
Thank you. Dr. Deborah Birx, who was then the coronavirus coordinator for the Trump White House, told the Select Subcommittee in a transcribed interview that she was constantly raising the alert about the dangers of Dr. Atlas's views on this pandemic. She warned that his wildly irresponsible herd immunity strategy was not implementable, and leading public health experts agreed at the time. Dr. Tan, why is mass infection, just letting the disease run over the population, a bad idea, even though it will activate natural immunity?
Well, the problem is that you're going to have a lot of individuals that are going to get seriously infected. They're going to be hospitalized, which is going to completely overwhelm the system. And there are going to be far more deaths if you let somebody just get infected to be infected. We see that with the chickenpox parties that used to be held, where people would know someone that had chickenpox, they would bring their children over to get infected. Some of those children would develop super infections with bacteria that landed them in the hospital with limb loss, other types of disfigurement, as well as deaths. So trying to have somebody just get a natural infection for immunity is a very risky and dangerous way, and vaccines are the safest way for you to get immunity.
It will lead to mass unnecessary suffering and death.
Correct.
And spread of the disease. Well, A systematic review published in Nature in January 2023 found that hybrid immunity was more protective than immunity after infection alone against the Omicron variant, and the effectiveness of previous infection against hospital admission or severe disease was 74%, and against reinfection, 24%. That's just having gotten it. But hybrid immunity, meaning you get the shot too, gives you 97% immunity against severe disease and hospital admission, and 41% against reinfection, as opposed to 24 without it. So that improves the odds too. So I guess my question to you is, do false and misleading claims about herd immunity and natural immunity ultimately undermine people's willingness to get vaccinated? And why is this debate so politicized and polarized?
Well, I'm a practicing clinician, so I can't comment on the politicization of it. But I can say that there already is some hesitancy with regards to receiving routine vaccinations. And with all the misinformation that was disseminated, it really fell on the COVID-19 vaccine to sort of push that to a different level.
I yield back. Thank you.
I now recognize Ms. Maliotakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to those testifying today. Ignoring the science of natural immunity led to prolonged lockdowns, school closures, vaccine mandates, people being fired, losing their livelihoods, particularly in a city like mine, New York. We had a labor shortage. We had many issues as a result. And early on, we knew that naturally acquired immunity was present for COVID-19, and just about everyone in the world was studying COVID-19 and finding individuals developed the natural immunity. Various studies showed that reinfections were rare, protection lasted around 1 year, individuals who were previously infected with COVID were likely to benefit from the vaccination. And the natural immunity, right? And a previous COVID-19 infection offers at least the same level or even superior protection as 2 doses of a Moderna or Pfizer vaccine. But even with all this data, the CDC and the Biden administration began to present a false message that receiving a COVID vaccination and booster was the only way to protect yourself against the virus. President Biden made multiple statements that simply did not follow the science, as those testifying today are affirming. He said, if you're vaccinated, you're not going to be hospitalized, you're not going to be in an IC unit, you're not going to die. That was false. He said, you're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations. That was also false. Dr. Fauci says you become a dead end for the virus. That was also false. And in New York City, all public employees, including teachers, police officers, firefighters, those frontline workers, they were mandated to get this vaccination or be terminated. And as a result, nearly 15,000 city workers were fired for not complying, many who had been recently infected. So since I joined Congress in 2021, I have fought for my constituents against these arbitrary and unscientific policies. I led a lawsuit that ended Mayor de Blasio's vaccine passport, where you couldn't even walk into a restaurant to get a sandwich unless you were vaccinated. Joined a lawsuit that struck down President Biden's vaccine mandate on the private sector. We fought New York City to drop vaccine mandates on the private sector and on the public sector and reinstate those that were fired. We also voted to lift that vaccine mandate on members of our military. Dr. Smuckenson, let me start with you. Did President Biden, Governor Cuomo, and Mayor de Blasio do a great disservice to our economy and society by not incorporating natural immunity into their policies?
Yes, I mean, the data showed that natural immunity was as protective as vaccinated immunity. And when we're talking about equitable policies, lower income minority communities tended to be less vaccinated, and relatedly, they also tended to have more natural immunity. So these vaccine passports that were enacted were actually quite inequitable as well, since they didn't make exemptions.
I agree, and that's why we sued to stop it. How was natural immunity not even a factor in these policy decisions that negatively impacted so many Americans?
I can't answer why it's been disregarded because other countries have acknowledged it. I mean, that's why these studies were run when the vaccines came out. They started getting busy on figuring out how does the vaccine compare to natural immunity. There was a big Israeli study to get at the prioritization of the vaccines, and so I don't know why it was
Dr.
disregarded.
McCary, do you have any inkling there?
I think you just heard why people don't want to recognize natural immunity. They associate it with a let it rip, try to get the infection strategy. No one is saying that. None of us have said that. Vaccines save lives. None of us, not even the Great Barrington Declaration folks or Scott Atlas. Look, I get it. You may not like Trump, but look at Sweden's deaths and look at Michigan's deaths. As you know, it's not fair to compare Florida and New York because they had infections at different times seasonally, and medicine advanced and it's lowering the infection fatality rate. But Sweden and Michigan are perfect comparisons. Same population, same percent of older people, identical populations. In the end, 37,000 deaths in Michigan, half, 17,000 in Sweden.
Thank you. I need to get one last question in because we recently were successful in getting the state and city universities of New York to roll back their vaccine mandates. Remember, these are young, healthier Americans who are attending our universities. Should private universities follow that and rescind their vaccine mandates?
Yes.
And Dr. Smuckenson?
Yes, of course.
Dr. Tan, I'll even let you answer there.
I think in certain situations, yes, they should rescind it. And again, we're in a different time than we were back when all this was occurring.
Thank you very much.
I now recognize Dr. Barra from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have to be really careful here because in this debate and dialogue, we need to make sure we're not sending a message to the public that vaccines are bad, right? You all would agree with that. I also think it's very dangerous to think in black and white that infection-acquired immunity was totally discounted. It wasn't. I mean, for folks that were on the front lines, for folks that were, as a doctor and former chief medical officer, when we didn't have vaccines and we were running short on health workers and so forth, we were in consultation with our hospitals and folks that got infected, survived. We understood that they had some natural immunity, and they often were the ones that were going back and taking care of COVID patients. So, while that wasn't, there was also consideration when we did have antibody tests. Do you go out and do mass availability of these antibody tests to determine who's had it, who hasn't had it? And so it wasn't black and white. I also understand from a public health perspective, when you're trying to launch a mass vaccination campaign, you often will think about things in broad terms. And mandates sometimes do compel folks to get that vaccine. Should we have been a bit more nuanced? Of course. Should we create exceptions for folks that say, look, I've already had COVID, who may be able to who are hesitant to get that vaccine, who may want to get that antibody test and demonstrate that they've got sufficient natural infection-acquired immunity? Yeah, we should always have flexibility. We should always be nuanced. Should politicians and elected officials be speaking in broad terms and generalities? No. I've never said that the vaccines were going to prevent illness because no vaccine is 100%. Are they reducing transmission? Yes. Are they reducing severe illness? Yes. Are they reducing death and morbidity and mortality? Yes. Those are all factual statements that we get. I also think we have to be very careful because we know COVID-19 is continuing to mutate. And while you may have natural immunity to a prior variant, we can't say with 100% certainty a new variant will not emerge where that prior immunity is going to be protective. We can also say the same thing about a prior vaccine, right? Part of the reason, Dr. McCary, that you said we constantly update our influenza vaccine is because it is constantly mutating and prior influenza vaccinations don't protect against new mutations. So we just have to be open to that because we may see a new variant emerge next fall that our current vaccines don't protect against or prior infection doesn't protect against. And I think we've got to be really, really careful in our messaging. Now, we also may see a new mutation emerge where prior vaccines are very protective and prior infection is very protective. So we've got to be open to that possibility as well. But I think for those of us who are on this committee, I think we've got to be very careful in making sure we don't feed into vaccine hesitancy. Let me ask a yes-no question. I think I know the answer to it. Separating out the COVID-19 vaccine, all of you believe that routine childhood vaccines, measles vaccines, all of that are incredibly important. Dr. McCary?
It is understood in medical vernacular after infection or infection-acquired immunity, not immunity from vaccine. Would you agree, Dr. McCary?
It's always been the case.
Dr. Smuckenson?
I mean, it's all the same cells being generated. In that sense, I guess it is natural, both of them, but one is a therapeutic and one is from the virus.
Correct. And Dr. Tan?
No, I mean, agreed that, you're generating the same cells to produce immunity to protect yourself. So in that sense, they're both natural.
Correct. But when we say natural immunity, we are referring to infection-acquired immunity. I want us to have the same language. And the reason that's important is because although I agree with almost everything Dr. Berra said, where I disagree was that natural or infection-acquired immunity was not discounted. I can tell you that I was censored. I was reported to the Board of Medicine in my state. I was, threatened to be taken off platforms. I've been on this committee now. This is my third year. I have asked this question of Dr. Fauci and of Dr. Walensky and of public health directors behind me who even into 2021 and 2022 were reluctant to acknowledge that there was infection-acquired immunity. And let me say, I was vaccinated. I gave the COVID-19 vaccines in all 24 of my counties. And when you talked about natural immunity, no one was suggesting that people go out and attend a COVID-19 party and not get vaccinated. What we were asking for the nuance that you mentioned, which was that we acknowledge that there is infection-acquired immunity, and therefore we risk stratify who we recommend vaccinations to, especially when you don't have enough vaccine to go around, and it's extraordinarily costly. That prepares us for the next pandemic. How we risk stratify, and this also goes into the concept of herd immunity, which is, again, that doesn't distinguish between natural immunity or vaccine-acquired immunity. It's the percent or the prevalence of the population that is immune. I even put forward a bill because of this difficulty with recognition of natural immunity. It was as if public health professionals and medical doctors lost their sense of their education in denying that there was such a thing. I put forth a bill to mandate testing by all insurance companies of both humoral immunity and T-cell immunity so people could document that they were immune and then not be fired from a job in the military or in the healthcare workforce or another job. And so if I sound passionate about this, I am extremely passionate about it because we have to get the science right. We have to get the messaging right. And the message was very wrong when we did not acknowledge infection-acquired immunity. We can do both. We can walk and chew gum. We can say there is infection-acquired immunity, but depending upon your risk level, it could be very detrimental for you to wait to get infection-acquired immunity. We can do both of those things, and it's important to do them. So I apologize. You can see the lack of responsiveness I got from four public health officials. We knew early on in 2021 about infection-acquired immunity, about a better level of immunity from both infection-acquired and COVID vaccine. And Dr. McCary, you conducted one of the first long-term studies to look at COVID antibody levels nearly 2 years after infection. What was it like trying to do this study, and did the NIH or CDC support your inquiry?
It was nearly impossible to study natural immunity. My Johns Hopkins colleagues and I published a study on natural immunity, basically drawing the blood of people who had COVID in the past and did not have vaccines to measure their antibody levels. And we found those antibodies were present and durable up to nearly 2 years after infection. Why did the NIH or CDC not invite some people who were infected in the early days in New York to test their blood? No one was supposed to talk about natural immunity. It was misinformation, even if it was scientifically valid, because they thought maybe somebody might try to get the infection. So let's not be honest with the American public. That's the basis for it, and that's what public health officials told me privately.
So like me, you have no idea why they ignored it.
There was no money for it. They didn't want to talk about it, and they wanted to promote an indiscriminate, all-or-nothing vaccine strategy that meant all the vaccines could be 4 today or 7, depending on your age, or nothing. And if you don't do all of them, you're not fully vaccinated, and you don't meet the criteria of the Novak-Djokovic doctrine. You're not allowed to travel into the United States. You're not allowed to play tennis outdoors. It was an absolutism. That's what ruined public health credibility, is not being honest.
And I apologize. Did this also lack of acknowledgement of infection-acquired immunity play into how often we recommended people to be boosted and the age at which they should both get COVID-19 vaccine and boosters, even if they had both infection and vaccine?
Yeah, for public health officials, it was all or nothing. Doctors on the ground were customizing their vaccine recommendations. You've had COVID twice, including 4 months ago. I'm not going to recommend the booster because you're young and healthy and there's no data to support it. That's how doctors practiced medicine, but that was labeled misinformation by the medical elites.
Thank you so much. And if I may, I'd like entered into a record a letter that the Doctors Caucus sent to Dr. Walensky in September of 2020, asking questions and making inquiries into infection-acquired immunity and looking at real-world evidence and data and research from other countries.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. I yield back my time.
I now recognize Mr. Mfume from Maryland for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to take exception with something that I heard here in this hearing, and that is that minorities, racial minorities across our country had a greater sense of immunity and were impacted less by this disease. In fact, infection-acquired immunity and all the other things were even more dangerous in minority communities, both when looking at death rates and broader inequalities in the healthcare system. In fact, the total cumulative data that we have and is available to all of us show that Black Americans, Hispanic, American Indians, Native Alaskans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders all suffered higher rates of COVID-19 cases and deaths. That is the record. So the suggestion from some that, well, it was not that bad in these minority communities, I think is a biased, xenophobic, and absolutely incorrect proposition to be putting forward. So let the record really reflect that those communities got hit harder, and those death rates were higher, and those cases went up. I think what we ought to do here is to sort of transport ourselves back to the dark, difficult days of COVID. We're looking back now as if we're looking through Alice in Wonderland's looking glass at what took place, and we all run the risk of being Monday morning quarterbacks. What we were dealing with in real time. Were there assumptions that were incorrect? Yes. Were there efforts underway to try to grab and get a hold of this? Yes. Did some of them work? No. Did some of them work? Yes. But when you're in the middle of a crisis, you're not trying to look to find the perfect way out. You want a way out to be able, particularly in this case, to save lives. So it's great to look back and say, if we could have, should have, would have. But the fact of the matter is that this entire nation was dealing with something in real time. People were washing their hands and told they need to wash them 20 to 30 times a day. Many of us thought that this disease was transmitted by touching. Others thought it was transmitted because of closeness. There were quarantine times that varied from 7 days to 17 days. Students on college campuses and other young people were afraid to get a vaccine because the social media posts were saying it will create infertility among you. We were washing our groceries as they were being dropped off at our door before we brought them into our homes. So we were in real time. And in real time, you're going to get some things right and you're going to get some things wrong. But at the end of the day, the real key is to try to find a way to save lives. Now, my bigger concern, Mr. Chairman, is that we don't play into this notion of vaccine hesitancy. It takes us down a dark, difficult path, and one that we all, I hope, don't want to go down, particularly when we see now that measles, mumps, and even polio are starting to reemerge in this country because of hesitancy, in many instances by parents to want to get vaccines for their children, and in other instances just because people have this boogeyman theory that somehow or another, if you put something in your arm that has been scientifically and medically researched and approved, that it's going to distort you, change your DNA, create a monster, or do something far worse. So I hope and really pray that this hearing does not add to this notion of vaccine hesitancy. Is it important to look back? Absolutely yes. That's the only way we can identify things that we agreed with, disagreed with, things that worked and didn't work. But to assign blame when we were all trying to figure this out together, I think is absolutely the wrong way to go. And that means Republican blame, Democratic blame, independent blame. We were all in real time. So it troubles me when I continue to see the sort of political machinations that are taking place, pointing the finger and blaming and said, we created a worse problem than we had. Actually, I thought we did pretty good getting out of the problem that we did have. And I think we have our larger medical community to thank for that, and the number of people who were on the line who were not physicians, but regular men and women who worked in jobs where they were very susceptible of becoming ill, who went to work every day, who we don't even talk about now because we took them for granted. So we've come a long way since we were in the middle of this crisis, and I think it's important to always keep that in consideration and in the right context. I yield back. Thank you, sir.
I now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Actually, if I may, before you begin, we'll reset the clock. Mr. Mbume, you made a statement, and I could recognize from the panel that they're confused on who you thought made a statement, and I'd like them to have the opportunity to maybe clarify or rectify or respond to the accusation of what someone said. You know, which
Sir, you are the chair, so
which doctor did you? I'd like to let them have the opportunity.
Dr. Smuckenson.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond. I actually do agree with you, and I said that the lower income communities did tend to have more natural immunity. They were more impacted by COVID-19. They were also tended to be less vaccinated. I think that those things are linked. When it came to the vaccine mandates that made no exemptions for natural immunity, my point was that those mandates were not very equitable because you wouldn't, if you're not making exemptions for natural immunity, those communities weren't able to live up to the mandate.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is a great discussion because the purpose of this committee, from my understanding, is to try to learn from what we did right and what we did wrong, so when the next pandemic comes along, we're not going to repeat it, hopefully. So my first question is for Dr. McCary. In October 2020, Rochelle Walensky, who would later become CDC director, co-authored a memorandum published in The Lancet that stated, quote, "There is no evidence for lasting protective immunity to SARS-CoV-2 following natural infection," unquote. Was there any data at the time that would have supported her statement or refuted her statement?
Well, first of all, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, and she should have known that all other viruses yield natural immunity with ultra-rare exceptions, including the 2 other coronaviruses that cause severe illness in humans. Both were studied to have long-term immunity. So I think it was intellectually dishonest, but even worse, she dug into her position as the data were overwhelming. Even to this day, the Yokovich Doctrine, in place yesterday in America, prevented teachers at federally funded schools from working. We won't allow people with natural immunity to work unless they have the full vaccine primary series. Well, guess what? We're hurting children from ignoring natural immunity. It's not historical. It's not looking back and blaming. It's right now. 160 schools in Missouri have gone down to a 4-day school week because they don't have enough teachers. They've left. Hospitals are understaffed. Response times are longer for first responders, not because of a historical mistake. They're still ignoring natural immunity. Even at my university, you can't go to school without the primary vaccine. Even if you've had COVID 3 times and we're in the ICU with myocarditis, you still need to get the COVID vaccine. That is intellectually dishonest.
Thank you. That's very passionate, very appropriate, because our last hearing we had was about school closures and how that adversely affected students. You know, did you bring this up? And I haven't done the research. So did you bring up the natural immunity, and were you shut down? Were you censored?
I was not censored. I always cited data, but I can tell you that natural immunity was considered misinformation by our public health oligarchs as they spread their own misinformation on many other topics.
In a related question to all 3 of you, in the early stages of the pandemic, do you believe that federal public health officials were aware of the centuries-old knowledge of infection-acquired immunity?
Yes, they were definitely aware of that, but even if they thought SARS-CoV-2 was different, certainly by mid-2020, there was a lot of immunological data showing that recovered patients had a very robust B-cell and T-cell response, and they were seeing that it was lasting over many, many months. So they did, and it was very similar to the T-cells that were made by SARS-1 that were still reactive almost 20 years later. So yes, I think they knew early on that natural immunity was strong.
I think they knew that there was some natural immunity. I would imagine that the question they were asking is, how much do you need to be protective? And, you know, at the time, because there was so much disease going around, they had to make very difficult decisions as to what was going to be beneficial for the majority of the individuals.
Did you want to add anything?
If I could just add, because in my role as editor-in-chief of MedPage Today, the 2nd largest trade publication read by doctors in the first 2 years of the pandemic, I asked, has anyone seen a healthy person who's recovered from COVID show up in an ICU? The answer was always no. Maybe there's somebody out there, but by and large, are protected against severe disease in the first 2 years. It was always right in front of our eyes. Saying we don't have a New England Journal of Medicine study where the editors are your friends and they called it misinformation, that was establishment group think. And the reality is we always knew those precious life-saving vaccines should not have been going to people first in line, already immune with natural immunity, as thousands die a day. So it wasn't a philosophical point. Thousands of Americans died from natural immunity, and over 1 million people left the workforce, and we are still suffering in schools and hospitals in all sorts of settings because of that ignorance, and they still have not issued any kind of apology, rehiring, or back pay in the vast majority of those instances.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I now recognize Ms. Ross from North Carolina for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start out, I know we've pointed a lot of figures in a lot of places on both sides of the aisle, but I want to commend the Biden administration's work in delivering and deploying COVID-19 vaccines. And there's no doubt that the strong coordination between public health organizations, governmental agencies, and healthcare professionals helped save countless lives. And that happened in my home state of North Carolina, where our Department of Health and Human Services went to every corner of the state, worked with Latino medical professionals, worked with the Native American community, helped the African American community overcome vaccine hesitancy from, a history of racial discrimination. And we need to praise the people who made sure that people who needed vaccines got them as quickly as they possibly could. And these efforts are a testament to our nation's ability to respond to a public health crisis. The rapid development, which I would give the Trump administration credit for, the delivery and the administration of vaccines was not only critical for our domestic response, but played a major role in the international community and was instrumental in saving lives around the world. We sent vaccines around the world. And our vaccine strategy strengthened our relationship with many of our allies and reaffirmed our commitment to addressing the pandemic on a global scale. I'd also like to address the fundamental representation that some, not all, of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made, which is that somehow infection-acquired immunity replaces the need for vaccine. We need them both. We need them both. While COVID-19 infections do confer immunity, it does not reduce the role that vaccines play in safely promoting widespread immunity. For example, any argument that assumes that everyone will survive a COVID-19 infection fails to take into account various risk factors that people face, particularly the elderly, and we saw that in nursing homes, people with underlying conditions, and people who are immunocompromised. And many of those people live in households with young, healthy people who might bring COVID into the home. My brother has lupus and lives in a household with teenagers. Dr. Tan, what risks do infections pose to the communities that I mentioned?
Actually, you bring up a really good point. Infection in those communities, so immunocompromised, the elderly, the very young, under a year of age, and those with, underlying comorbidities, infection really significantly increases the risk of the development of complications, hospitalizations, and dying from COVID-19.
And did we see people dying?
Absolutely.
And does vaccination reduce the threat of infection posed to these particular communities?
Absolutely.
Also, I want to talk about long COVID. Long COVID has been shown to be more frequent and more severe among people who are not vaccinated. Dr. Tan, how do other effects of long COVID factor into the vaccine versus infection-acquired immunity conversation?
So that's a very good point in that we know that if someone is vaccinated, they are significantly less likely to develop symptoms of long COVID. And the same is true for multisystem inflammatory syndrome, which is one of the consequences that we see both in children and adults, but much more in children. And those that are unvaccinated are much more likely to go on to develop MIS-C as opposed to those that are vaccinated.
In the few seconds that I have left, Dr. Tan, in your written testimony, you note the body of evidence for infection-acquired immunity is more limited than for vaccine-induced immunity. Can you explain this a little bit more?
So, I think what we're learning is that with vaccine-acquired immunity, we know that it does provide protection and that the amount of protection has changed a bit with regards to the emergent variants of Omicron that have now become the main players for COVID now. And so with that, we are able to produce a vaccine that is going to be effective and provide better immunity against the Omicron variants. Likewise, we know from one of the studies that the immunity that you get from infection-induced immunity prior to the Omicron does not protect as well against preventing reinfection with an Omicron variant.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Cloud from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to take a moment and kind of clear up some of the really misinformation even coming from this campaign. The ranking member has alluded a number of times, along with some members of his side of the committee, that those of us who are saying that public officials should have considered naturally acquired immunity and the data there and the over millennia of scientific understanding about that, that we were somehow advocating for COVID catching parties is absolutely, it's ridiculous, and it itself is misinformation. Using that same logic model, I could claim that they are advocating that the government public officials should be lying to the American people in order to enforce mandates and do other kind of things that happen to keep people out of their profession, to keep medical experts who were speaking to this issue out of their scientific understanding and data, that they should have been banned from big tech and conspiring with big pharma to do that. I'm not making that accusation, but that's exactly what the same logic model would do. And so I think it's time that we get back to talking about what happened, because vaccine hesitancy is an issue. I'm thankful that the vaccine was created. I'm thankful that it was developed and that for those that it helped. What is a big definite issue, and even a bigger issue, and certainly within the jurisdiction of this committee as a subcommittee of government oversight, is to make sure that our taxpayer-funded public health officials are not conspiring against the very people they're supposed to be serving. Time and time again, the American people were told by Dr. Fauci, Biden administration, to take the vaccine. And at the time, it was experimental at best. The data was very new. It was necessary. There was emergency use authorization because we didn't know what we were dealing with. But then it began to be mandated on the people. People lost jobs. Suddenly, vaccine passports were made a reality. And if the shutdowns weren't damaging enough, we had medical people that were taken out of the industry when they were supposed to be helping people. These people, many of them decided not to take the vaccine, not because of the conspiracy theories or anything like that, but just because they had natural immunity. Many studies early on, or at least certainly a few months into it, gave us data that would lead that this was an issue that should have been concluded. I'd like to submit to the record an August 2021 study later published in the Journal of Clinical Infectious Diseases, which found that natural immunity offered up to 13 times more protection than vaccine immunity versus Delta, suggesting that waning vaccine efficiency and robust and durable immunity for previously infected persons. An August 2021 study published by the Journal of Science, which found broad antibody response from infection-derived immunity that protected against a wide variety of COVID variants. A September 2021 study published in Nature, which showed natural immunity offered as good or better protection against the Delta variant. A November 2021 article in The Lancet regarding natural immunity, which stated that protection from reinfection is strong and persists for more than 10 months of follow-up, and also asked why natural immune persons weren't given the same considerations as vaccinated people. A November 2021 response to a FOIA request by the CDC, in which they stated they could not provide any documentation of naturally immune persons getting reinfected and then being transmitted to someone else. In a September 30th ABC article, that was titled Hundreds of Hospital Staffers Fired or Suspended for Refusing COVID-19 Vaccine Mandates, that talked about President Biden mandating vaccines for healthcare industry. Dr. McCary, I'd like to ask you about the ethical concerns you have about the federal government mandating or compelling medical treatment that provides such treatment with financial, that the big pharma basically can benefit from.
It's really tragic because I heard from many parents who said, look, my child we're concerned about myocarditis. Maybe they had myocarditis in the past, and they're being told you still need to get the vaccine. They already had high levels of antibodies. A nurse who was going to get fired for not being vaccinated already had high levels of the antibodies that neutralized the COVID virus, but they were antibodies that Dr. Fauci did not recognize. And so we had 1 million people leave the workforce, and hospitals are understaffed. So Dr. Fauci in early of 2022 sees the mountain of evidence out there on natural immunity, including the studies you cited, and he says, you know what, we've got to address this. A Biden administration official has a phone call with Dr. Fauci and 4 invited doctors, loyal friends of the Biden administration who supported mandates and restrictions, and they asked them, should we give credit for a vaccine if you had natural immunity? The vote was tied 2-2, and Dr. Fauci says, you know what, we're just going to continue to ignore natural immunity. And we have the Yokovich doctrine that lives up until yesterday. Why would you put such a critical vote on policy in front of a straw poll of a couple like-minded friends?
That's tragic. Literally. I yield back.
Yeah, Mr. Cloud, without objection, the articles you referenced submitted for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I was mayor of Long Beach for the last 8 years. We have a large public health department, city about 500,000 people. So I saw firsthand the impact of our vaccine rollout and how important it was to public health. And our region and broader LA County was hit really hard during 2020, 2021, during that winter surge. Of course, before vaccines were available, our regional healthcare system was at a breaking point. ICUs were full. On certain days, we were losing dozens of lives across LA County. It was a horrific experience. In my city alone, we lost 1,300 people from our community. We know that across the country, we've lost over 1.3 million American lives. One of those lives was my mother. Another was my stepfather. I know the impacts of this pandemic and how destructive it can be on families. I want to remind us that during that time, even there was a regional quality health index around on the quality of air, and the amount of crematoriums that were actually having to be in operation were damaging health air quality. That's how horrific the time was. And I think it's important to remember how bad the pandemic actually impacted us, because I think we have a tendency to forget the lives impacted and the real impact to our economy as well. We did everything we could to get folks vaccinated in Long Beach. We were the first city to vaccinate 99% of our seniors in California, the first city in the state of California to vaccinate our teachers. Both the governor and the president called our approach a national model. But I'm very concerned about the attack on vaccination efforts. I'm very concerned when folks within the Congress, even on this committee, put out disinformation about what vaccines are. There are 3 million Americans today that are likely alive thanks to vaccinations. We know this. And despite this, many of our colleagues in the majority have chosen to undermine COVID vaccinations in general. I want to also point out that misinformation hurts our efforts. We know that Republicans in general are 2.5 more times likely to believe misinformation, and studies have shown that states with higher vaccination rates have had significantly fewer COVID deaths. So these are facts. I want to share some examples of this harmful misinformation today and the rhetoric that has actually led to, I think, a huge public health emergencies in this country. This is the first one tweet that's actually been sent out by a member of this committee, which essentially says that we're suggesting that COVID vaccines are associated with nearly 6,000 deaths and actually encouraging folks to not get vaccinations. Dr. Tan, what do you think about this claim about the 6,000 deaths around vaccinations?
Well, in this country, we have a very, very robust vaccine system that looks at all the different potential adverse effects that may be associated with vaccines. So the problem is that some of these deaths, even though they are reported, it may have been the vaccine was given, but the death was not due to the vaccine itself.
Absolutely right. And to say no, do not get the vaccine is completely irresponsible. Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Dr. Tan, I also would like to go to the second.
The gentleman will suspend.
The member's remarks are clearly disparaging a member of this committee and a member of Congress.
I'm just clearly pointing out facts from public
The
statements.
chair reminds the gentleman from California to observe proper decorum. The issues we are debating are important ones that members feel deeply about. While vigorous disagreement is part of the legislative process, members are reminded that we must adhere to established standards of decorum in debate. It is a violation of House rules and the rules of this committee to engage in personalities regarding other members or to question the motives of a colleague. Remarks of that type are not permitted by the rules and are not in keeping with the best traditions of our committee. The chair will enforce these rules of decorum at all times and urges all members to be mindful of their remarks.
Mr. Chairman?
You may proceed.
I have a point of order on this side.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know that the gentleman from California was disparaging anyone. He put up a tweet that is a fact that exists online, available for anybody to look at. And so because we customarily throughout the Congress will take quotations and quotes and use them once they appear in the public record, I think this is in keeping with that, and I don't think this was an effort to disparage, but an effort to instead point out what a particular member or members of this committee may have put out themselves in the public space that we all refer to as social media.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the member said she was clearly trying to cause harm.
At this point, it is the ruling of the chair that the gentleman may proceed. However, I remind the gentleman to be cautious and to understand the decorum as he proceeds with his remaining time of 1 minute and 46 seconds.
Thank you very much. I'll just read the next few public statements. I appreciate that. This next tweet actually, and I'll just go ahead and read what it says here. It says by a member of this committee, the FDA should not approve the COVID vaccines. There are too many reports of infection and spread of COVID-19 among vaccinated people. These vaccines are failing and do not reduce the spread of the virus, and neither do masks. You can read the rest of it here. Dr. Tan, what do you think about this tweet? About the FDA not approving vaccines. You think that's helpful or hurtful in vaccine information or misinformation?
I think it would be hurtful if the FDA did not approve the COVID vaccines, because we know that COVID vaccines saved millions of lives by their approval and their use.
And I'll show you one last one just to ensure that we're on track. And I'll just read the tweet. It's a public statement. This tweet actually says that vaccinated employees get a vaccination logo just like the Nazis forced Jewish people to wear a gold star. Vaccine passports and mask mandates create discrimination against unvaxxed people who trust their immune systems to a virus that is 99% survivable. Do you think that this tweet, which compares vaccinated people to Jewish folks living under the Nazis, what kind of impact would this have, you think, on public health?
I think it would have a negative impact on public health, and I respectfully disagree with that particular sentiment that has been put forth. I mean, we know that vaccines are life-saving, and they should be made available to everyone so that there's no disparity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tan. I really appreciate that. I think it's really important for us to remind the committee and the public about public statements that are made by members of this committee, particularly as questions are asked. And so thank you very much all for your service. I yield back.
I now recognize Dr. Joyce from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's regain the focus of this hearing, which is, and again, I quote, investigating pandemic immunity, acquired, therapeutic, or both. In January 2022, data from the CDC Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report showed that during the Delta surge, case rates for individuals with previous infection and no vaccination were nearly 4 to 5 times lower than case reports for those individuals who were only vaccinated. CDC data showed that the hospitalization rates also followed that similar pattern. Yet despite this data and decisions made by other nations, including the EU, to recognize the recovery from COVID-19 on the same level as vaccination status, the administration still maintained or fought to maintain a variety of vaccine mandates, either through CMS, the Department of Labor, that failed to account for the importance of natural immunity. Dr. McCary, in your opinion, as a physician, what impact has the administration's disconnect between the data and the policy regarding natural immunity had on the credibility of the CDC and actually the Biden administration at large?
Well, there were a lot of broken promises, regardless of what political party somebody is a member of. The promise by the Biden administration and Dr. Fauci is that we would not have vaccine mandates. That was a broken promise. They ignored natural immunity right up until this day in all their policies. And this has resulted in damaged public trust. Now, we've been, for centuries, building public trust in the medical profession. A lot of that went down the drain when they lied to the American people, saying that schools have to be closed for 2 years and cloth masking of toddlers was important to stop the transmission. They never even gave us the proper data on COVID and children. Ask any pediatrician or public health official or CDC official or Fauci or Walensky, how many healthy children have died of COVID in the last 3 years? They can't tell you. Was it 90% of the deaths in children with special medical conditions? That matters because when you have a healthy young male who's at the lowest risk of COVID and the highest risk of myocarditis, you might want to modify the vaccine recommendation if they already have circulating antibodies from natural immunity. They did not, and that was the intellectual dishonesty we saw from public health officials.
Thank you. Dr. McCary, do you feel the processes by which the CDC drafts and formulates, seeks input from internal and external stakeholders, and finalizes its recommendations and guidance, including morbidity and mortality weekly reports, are sufficient, and do they properly reflect the views of the outside or any contrarian opinion?
No. The CDC's own non-peer-reviewed journal called MMWR is a joke. It is a joke. They published their own flawed studies. They weaponized research. They looked at a small sliver of data from the state of Kentucky. It was the most horrific methodologic study you could possibly design. And they conclude, hey, natural immunity is no good. The study was entirely flawed, and everybody falls for it. The medical community claps like seals, and this is great, ignoring the 130 studies at the time and the incredible historical record from all the way back to 430 BC that natural immunity is effective. And we never saw people the first 2 years who were healthy come back with severe disease after they recovered. And that should have been a sign that we were being deceived by the weaponization of research itself.
And you bring in an interesting discussion point. You called it a joke, but the American people are not laughing. The American people want to understand, does natural immunity work? And we have evidence now that it does. Many of us on this panel feel that the CDC was very slow in reporting data, specifically related to vaccines and natural immunity, that they did have throughout the pandemic. How can we promote better data stewardship through the CDC? And most important, how do we restore the trust in the CDC with a public, which I have stated, are not laughing, with a public that is increasingly skeptical of the mandates, with a public that does not respect top-down government approaches? Is there a way through this?
We need an apology from public health officials. We need to have scientific debate, not using censorship, but instead using scientific evidence. And I think we need some humility from public health officials. Neither vaccinated immunity nor natural immunity are perfect. Let's not try to suggest the other side is all evil. But it's not an either. We can be honest with the public about the data and still recommend safe practices today.
Thank you for the discussion about honesty. I thank you for being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you.
I now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As discussed here today in this hearing, the science we had at the time when vaccine mandates were put in place supported the concept that infection-acquired immunity not only provided protection, but looks like it actually provided superior protection compared to immunity acquired by the vaccine. This is also something that we probably knew was true based on many other studies of other coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS. It was stated earlier that natural immunity was not disregarded in the healthcare system. I just want to point out that that's absolutely not true. Natural immunity was discounted in the medical community, and that was evidenced by the large number of healthcare workers that were subsequently fired because they refused to get the vaccine, ones that had documented COVID infections and had recovered from it. And that brings up a point. It was also made, a point was made earlier that you did not, that you needed to rely on antibody testing, and that made it impossible to use natural immunity as a reason to let people come to work or stay at work and not be dismissed. That's also not true, and it's a little bit of it's somewhat of a ridiculous excuse that was used in the efforts to undermine any ability to be able to use natural immunity for the purpose of keeping people at work or at school or wherever. You didn't need that. If you had otherwise healthy individuals with documented COVID and they had recovered, you could reliably credit them with natural immunity. We know this, right? If they tested and people were testing extensively, if they tested and they tested positive, they went home, they recovered from their infection, they came back, you could reliably say they had the infection, they recovered from it, and they would have natural immunity. We know this for a variety of reasons, some of which I just described. Dr. Tan, I want to ask you to speak on a few things. Can you speak on why hospitals nationwide fired rather than hired unvaccinated nurses, physicians, and other staff with infection-acquired immunity?
I don't have a comment on that. I don't know the reason that hospitals did that. But, you know, I think now we know, now there's more data on the fact that you do have immunity after infection and that immunity can play a role in being protective, but I can't comment on why hospitals would have fired individuals.
I mean, this kind of stuff is still going on today, and we obviously know this now, and it's still happening today. Why did hospitals implement the vaccine mandates without providing exceptions for staff with infection-acquired immunity? Do you know the answer to that?
I do not know the answer to that. I can say that it was probably because they wanted to protect as many patients as possible from not getting COVID from the person taking care of them. And again, the pandemic has evolved so that, you know, when some of this was occurring early on, it was a matter of trying to protect the patients and the people providing care to the patients so that we didn't have COVID being transmitted in the hospital setting.
Can you tell me how many staff members were let go or put on leave at your hospital for not getting the COVID-19 vaccine?
So people were not fired at my hospital.
So if they refused the vaccine, they were allowed to continue to work and provide care to patients?
In certain places in the hospital, yes.
So no one at your hospital was dismissed at all for refusal to get a COVID vaccine?
I don't know about at all, but if there were a number, it was really very, very small. I mean, we really tried to retain as many individuals as possible.
Well, I wish I could say that was the case all over the country, but it definitely wasn't. It wasn't in the area that I represent. There were many healthcare workers that either had the choice of leaving voluntarily or being fired because they refused to get the vaccine. And many of them were doing it because they understood that they had infection, natural immunity because they had previously had an infection that recovered from it. Some of them had actually been sick more than once and had recovered, and they'd been tested multiple times, and it was well documented. And I just think it led to a lot of problems, and it probably led to a lot of excess deaths that we had these shortages nationwide when we had providers that were sitting at home not able to take care of patients. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I now recognize Dr. McCormick for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy you're here. I consider you experts. I consider you highly qualified to be in front of us today. And yet I find it somewhat ironic, as we did our pre-interview before you started testifying, we talked about the number of patients that we treat. And it's ironic that there's a lot of people out there that consider themselves experts without your intelligence, without your experience, without your acumen. that we're able to censor people like myself, who's seen more patients than probably all three of our experts here today, for COVID, that is. And indeed, as a matter of fact, probably in all the hearings we've had so far, all the experts that have come and testified before us are very smart people and have so much great expertise, and yet I was censored. Censored by the government, who had not treated one COVID patient, censored by experts who had seen minimal of any patients, and that was allowed. As a matter of fact, it was encouraged by the government. When the president's press secretary says, we are openly working with media outlets, and I quote, to decide who to censor. That is our government talking about censoring experts. I just wanted to point that out, that the irony already. I think it's really important when we talk about treating patients and when we're exposed. By the way, it may surprise you to know that I'm one of the first people to ever get the vaccination in America, because I was on the front lines of COVID. And it was a novel virus. And I didn't know if I had immunity or not. Now, I knew it had been around for a while because we had all kinds of weird fevers and symptoms. So probably I might have had some immunity, but I got the vaccination because I believed in the science. But as science developed, and so did our immunity, the irony is that once we were known to be immune, once I had the vaccination and I continued to be exposed, but to thousands of patients, the booster shot continued to be explained to be something that's beneficial, even when the CDC admitted that it was, at best, minimally effective for the highest risk patients. And yet still we're pushing it on pediatric patients who had been exposed and symptomatic, with no studies on the side effects of this vaccination. So how am I supposed to trust a government that's pushing something with no evidence and possible real harm when our whole Hippocratic oath starts with do no harm? And so I wanted to ask you, sir, I've read your book, and I think you're an expert in the field. I want to ask you, what do you think this does for the trust in our government, our CDC, and those people who play politics with medicine?
I think public health officials need to come clean and say, we got natural immunity way wrong. We were so wrong on this long after the data were available. We're sorry, lives were ruined. If you look at what social media and big tech did to any data, scientific or an experience of a parent on vaccine complications, it is entirely un-American. You have a rate of myocarditis of 1 in 6,000, and when parents asked about that, shut up. You shouldn't be asking those questions. If you posted any study that pointed out the complications, it was censored. Ask any pediatrician recommending the COVID vaccine 3 shots for a young, healthy 12-year-old girl, what is the rate of myocarditis? Ask them, what do you think of the Swiss study that 2% of people after the vaccine had an elevated troponin, an indicator of heart damage, as you know, as a physician? Ask them about that.
So I'm on limited time, so I couldn't agree with you more. Here's the problem. We in America have been very shorted on the studies allowed to find out the damage of vaccinations. And in fact, I'm sure any immunologist would know that once you're immune to something and you are exposed to it repeatedly, you're likely to have a hyperimmune response because your body's already prone. And it's something that causes you hypercoagulability or inflammation that can cause a stroke, a heart attack, a DVT, or any sort of pleural thickening in your lung, things that are life-threatening. To expose yourself to a pathogen, even if it's a vaccination, and that immune response that could cause real harm has not been studied. We have not had an honest conversation. And to point out another point of hypocrisy in our government, by the way, these same people that worry about disease in our population are the same ones who opened up the southern border. And ironically, they limited our travel, United States citizens' travel and business, by their vaccination status and their testing status. Meanwhile, they let hundreds of thousands, maybe even actually millions of people across the southern border without a test, without a vaccination, indeed disseminated them during the worst part of the pandemic all over the United States. Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. And by the way, my ER was overwhelmed by an incredible amount of people who were infected by COVID, and you had civilians, citizens paying taxes, waiting behind in line for people who are not only not paying taxes, but not paying their bills, so that they could pay the bills for those people that are waiting behind. Think about that and let that set in as you pay your taxes this year. With that, I yield.
I now recognize Ms. Takuda from Hawaii for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's set the record straight on the role COVID-19 vaccine policies and boosters have played in reopening America's schools and businesses, preventing hospitalizations, and most importantly, saving lives. In the winter of 2020, when we were battling a new surge of COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths, we needed to meet the moment and rapidly deploy safe, effective vaccines to the American people. Thanks to Democrats' American Rescue Plan, we did just that. The American Rescue Plan included $7.5 billion for vaccine distribution and administration nationwide, quickly getting shots in those arms. Of these funds, $20 million went to my home state of Hawaii, which helped fully vaccinate over 80% of Hawaii residents, one of the highest vaccination rates in the country. The rollout of COVID-19 vaccine has been so successful, and in large part thanks to the American Rescue Plan's bold investments and the Biden administration's decisive leadership to protect Americans' health and safety with common sense policies that encourage vaccinations across the board. In fact, after President Biden announced vaccination policies for federal employees and contractors in July 2021, we saw a 40% increase nationwide in vaccination rates in just 4 months. Coupled with additional measures to protect healthcare workers and robust federal investments in vaccine distribution, these policies have resulted in a decline in COVID-19 deaths by 95% and hospitalizations by 91%. Let's put this another way. In the first 9 months of the pandemic, the U.S. recorded 798,000 COVID-19 related deaths. By comparison, we saw less than half that amount in the following 2 years, from December 2020, when vaccines were first made available, through November 2022. That's a huge deal. Dr. Tan, as a physician who has been on the front lines of the pandemic, had we not taken these clear, decisive, coordinated steps to get people vaccinated as quickly as possible, would more people have died? Would more Americans today be experiencing severe illness? Would hospitalization still be strained in terms of the number of patients coming through our doors? Thank you. Now, we know that if we relied solely on immunity through infection, which was what we had prior to the vaccination being developed, when we saw more than twice the amount of deaths than we have in the last 2 years, the situation in the United States would have been much worse. The state where I'm from in Hawaii, we saw quick adherence to vaccination requirements. This led to a record amount of vaccinations, but also what it led to was the lowest death rates and rates of infection across the country. Something else I'd like to touch upon is the importance of vaccines keeping pace with the highly infectious variants we are seeing emerge today. Dr. Tan, we know that immunity from infection alone does not adequately protect against variants. Can you explain how COVID-19 booster shots have been critical to protect us against emerging variants, but also helping us to keep schools open, a topic we've discussed in this committee, businesses up and running, and the rest of society safe as we reopen and try to keep our community clean of infection as well?
Yes, the bivalent boosters give you specific immunity to the Omicron subvariants. And that's currently what is circulating at this time. And by having high immunity to that, you basically are protecting individuals so that they are able to go out into the community and resume more activities of daily life, such as going to work, going to school, patronizing local businesses, meeting with family members, etc.
Thank you. You know, in the small remaining time I have left, I wanted to touch upon one other topic. Unfortunately, misinformation about vaccine safety, a side effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, has undermined confidence in long, trusted, safe, and effective vaccines. UNICEF has warned parents of the danger presented by vaccine misinformation. The world is experiencing the largest global decline in decades in the number of children receiving basic immunization. And today, these declining vaccination rates are driving outbreaks of previously controlled diseases like polio, whooping cough, and measles. Doctors, I understand, take a Hippocratic oath, we just heard about it, to do no harm. As we see a resurgence of once dormant diseases as a result of vaccine misinformation, how harmful is this erosion of vaccine confidence to the health and wellness of our children, our families, and our communities?
It is enormously negatively impactful. If we start to see outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases, you are going to get a lot of morbidity and mortality that may be associated with that are occurring, especially in the pediatric population, in people that are immunocompromised, and in the elderly. So we need to be able to control these diseases because all of these diseases are and can be fatal.
Thank you. If I'm hearing you right, eroding confidence in vaccines results in deaths. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back my time. Thank you, Dr. Tan.
I now recognize Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While some members on this committee have decided to use their time to disparage me and my tweets and provide misinformation at this very important committee hearing, I'd like to talk about the biggest spreader of misinformation, and that would be the President of the United States. As a matter of fact, just months before the FDA approved the experimental COVID vaccines, President Biden said, if you get vaccinated, you won't get COVID. Then, it just so happened 1 year later, the press secretary announced that after 4 vaccine doses, COVID vaccine doses, that President Biden tested positive for COVID again and was experiencing mild symptoms. That's quite a lot different than if you get vaccinated, you won't get COVID-19. That's spreading misinformation. Also, I'd like to talk about how the definition of vaccine was changed, and this is really important to talk about. Pre-2015, the CDC's definition of vaccination was an injection of a killed or weakened infectious organism in order to prevent the disease. Then in 2015 to 2021, the definition of vaccination, according to the CDC, is the act of introducing a vaccine into the body to produce immunity to a specific disease, produce immunity. Then, just right after, literally right after the CDC or the FDA approves the experimental COVID-19 vaccines, they changed the definition of vaccination again. The new definition was changed to the act of introducing a vaccine into the body to produce protection from a specific disease. Talk about spreading misinformation. I think that it's our governing bodies and the Biden administration and many Democrats that were spreading misinformation about what these so-called vaccines, and I'm going to tell you right now, I don't think these are vaccines at all. A vaccine would stop the spread of a disease. A vaccine would provide immunity. But obviously, the President of the United States got four COVID-19 vaccines and still tested positive for COVID. Mr. McCary, is that, what's the difference there if after 4 COVID-19 vaccines, clearly vaccine so-called immunity, if the president had had natural immunity, would he have continued to get tested or promoted this experimental vaccine?
I don't know. I do know that people who are against the COVID vaccine, and I may not see eye to eye on everything, but I understand why they are angry. I understand where they're coming from because they've been lied to time and time again. Even recently, the bivalent vaccine, we heard from the White House podium, the data are crystal clear. Oh, really? It was approved based on data from 8 mice. Where's the randomized controlled trial? Instead, they weaponize research in the government and say, okay, here's a non-randomized trial. People who got the bivalent did better. Well, guess what? They're a different type of person. They're a different risk profile. That is the ultimate failure of our government, is the lack of a critical appraisal of important research on vaccines, on vaccine complications, and on so many other issues like natural immunity.
I agree with you, and I actually support many vaccines, but not an experimental vaccine that was government mandated on the public. Dr. Tan, you said that COVID vaccines are safe and side effects are mild. I'd like to talk to you about so-called, according to you, mild side effects. Let's talk about how 9 days after receiving the vaccine, a 6'9" healthy 17-year-old Everest Romney was admitted to the ICU with blood clots in his brain. Anyone who talked about the incident on social media was censored. 9 months later, he was admitted for a second time. Doctors found another blood clot a deep vein in his right leg, and potentially permanent heart inflammation. Let's talk about myocarditis, like the NCAA Division I student athlete golfer John Stokes, diagnosed with myocarditis 4 days after receiving his second dose. On his own TikTok video in the hospital, he was explaining what happened to him. That was not misinformation. That was his own testimony. And many other athletes, and especially young men who have had myocarditis, and it can be a lifelong disabling condition, as you know. So how can you call those side effects mild?
In the vast majority of individuals, the side effects from COVID-19 vaccine are mild and temporary. And that's why the VAERS system in this country works so well, because of the billions of doses of...
I'll remind you that there's been 948,617 VAERS reports on the COVID-19 vaccine. That's way higher than the flu, and that's much higher than the zoster vaccines. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses here today for your testimonies. It's greatly appreciated. And at this time, I would now like to yield to Ranking Member Ruiz for a closing statement, if he would like one.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have heard a number of different perspectives today, and I want to bring us back to where we started. In the early days of the pandemic, we were dealing with a deadly, highly transmissible, and highly mutating virus. As we planned our public health strategy, we prioritized saving lives and the prevention of future harm, and keeping our healthcare system at or below capacity. And that strategy was successful. As I said at the beginning, the Biden administration's implementation of the largest, most successful vaccine administration program in history prevented an estimated 3.2 million deaths. As an added bonus, it saved the United States over $1 trillion in medical costs. So as we wrap up this conversation, and as we have future conversation this subcommittee, I just ask that we keep our eye on the ball and focus on the prevention of harm and the prevention of getting infected. This will almost always involve the proven public health measures that we know work, such as vaccines that are known to be safe in a public health perspective, effective, and vaccines that have saved lives. And let us be cautious about the impacts our words can have. Nuance is good, yes, but we cannot get to a place where we are explicitly or implicitly sowing distrust in COVID vaccines by focusing on the small percentage of, for example, the severe side effects, when we know at a population base it is safe and the symptoms are mild. And it has helped us get to where we are today. So we have a process to study vaccines, and they were studied, and we know who are at high risk because of those studies, and there are contraindications to people getting this vaccine. And there are risks, or some people, and those are the people that physicians use the data to recommend not getting the vaccines. So let's be nuanced, let's use our words carefully, and let's sow trust in public health measures. Let's go back to understanding that this virus spreads from airborne, oral aerosols to the public, and that any covering blocks that aerosol from leaving your mouth. Now, some coverings are better than others, some aren't as good, but by reducing those molecules, you reduce the risk of transmission. So yes, masks help to reduce the risks of transmission. Just like masks, if these molecules are transmitted by your mouth, when you speak, you cough, you scream, or sing, then the further you are, the less likely you'll come by being infected with a droplet that will either you breathe in through your nose, your mouth, your eyes. So yes, in these circumstances, social distancing is a preventative measure. It's a public health measure. So vaccines do work. Vaccines are safe. I do not wish anybody, regardless of whether a natural infection can cause a more robust immune response, to go and get infected, or to want to get infected, or to disregard the importance of a vaccine. I don't want a Republican or a Democrat or anybody to get the symptoms, to have enough viral load to transmit it to a more higher risk person, or to risk themselves being hospitalized or even death. And those who have been vaccinated, if you fall under the category of being high risk or not immunocompetent, then I would still recommend to take all the precautions, because you can still get sick and you can still be hospitalized and you can still die. So it is nuanced, and we have to work within that nuance. And I do believe that in future pandemics, we shouldn't be stuck that are unknown viruses that can kill people, that are rapidly transmissible, that we should be focusing on just disregarding safety precautions by saying that your getting infected is going to be a protection. So let's just be careful on the way we present this, and let us work always to put people over politics. Those are my hopes for this subcommittee, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and I will say that I continue to look forward to working with Dr. Ruiz through this process over the next year and a half, as we have worked well together in the past, and I think we will continue to do our best to possibly have differences of opinions, which doctors sometimes do, and move forward with something that we can present to the American people as a better pathway for the next pandemic. We're advocating for a multi-pronged strategy to defeat COVID or the next pandemic. A majority of Americans have had COVID and have had infection-acquired immunity. We can learn a lot from that, and we should try to. I don't believe that herd immunity was ever the Trump White House's strategy. I know people talked about it. I don't think that was ever the strategy. Protecting the most vulnerable, we saw emergency use authorization for the vaccine, and it was there for the elderly and those with comorbidities. And that was always a priority. And reality suggested that this contagious disease would continue to spread throughout the nation. Understanding infection-acquired immunity and protections it offers is essential, in my opinion, in order to resume normal life in America and end things like lockdowns. It needs to be considered. And false statements, no matter where they were coming from, especially if they're coming from a leadership position, is wrong. And we can look at studies, and we can look at comparing Sweden and Michigan. Michigan had severe lockdowns and mandates. Sweden did not. Sweden had half the deaths. What's up with that, right? Why can't we look at that? So, as doctors, you can, if you're honest with yourself, as doctors, researchers, you can look at a study and say, this is a flawed study, or this is a very good study. This is a very good study without any type of bias whatsoever. We know how to do that, and we need to do that and not pretend. I'm curious because I haven't ever seen anything on the initial studies, and I was very involved. We were involved with as a doctor's caucus, looking at what was taking place with Operation Warp Speed and understanding the technology, but also how the studies were being conducted. Normally, before FDA approval, you have 8,000 to 10,000 people in a study. They have 30,000 to 40,000 people, and I applaud those brave Americans that got in these studies that helped us produce a vaccine. The one thing I'm curious about is those that got the placebo and got COVID, did we look at their immunity from it? Did we make that part of our study? As far as I know, we did not. We missed that. We should have done that. That should have been part of what we're doing. Lesson for the future, in my opinion. We have two or three doctors on this very committee that have actually been treating patients during COVID. And, I can tell you, they feel, and they said today, that, infection-acquired immunity was ignored. And when they spoke about it, they were censored. These are facts that are coming out. We got to address this and quit playing politics with it and say that was a wrong thing for any government to do on behalf of the health of the American people. Look, I got vaccinated. I also was out in military uniform with the National Guard, testing people, driving up testing. I was out giving shots with the National Guard, and when my local hospital said, can you come out? Or can you come out to the fairgrounds and vaccinate people as they're coming through to be part of this mission? So when the implication is that, people on one side or the other are saying, oh, it's natural immunity only, that's not true. And it doesn't help this committee when we have comments like that coming from this committee. Let's be serious about what people were actually doing and saying and what their concerns are. And by the way, an opinion is far different from misinformation. And if we're not allowed to have opinions in the medical community anymore, then we are doomed. We are absolutely doomed going forward. More times than one, I'd say to a patient, here's what I believe. And if I see some hesitancy, I'd say, I would like you to get another opinion. And I think that's a wise thing to do. So when we have opinions, it's not necessarily misinformation. But the fact of the matter is, false statements were made by many. Whether they intended them to be false or they knew they were false, I don't know. But they were false statements that were being made. And some of these people served on both administrations that were doing this. I don't think it helped with that. That does dissipate trust in our public health system. As I said earlier, I had recommended under the Trump administration, let America hear from the doctors treating COVID patients every day. Not someone sitting in a lab, not someone that's not bedside with anybody. Let them tell us what's actually going on. And I think that is a lesson learned that we have to move forward. Now, I heard Ms. Ross say she gave credit to the Trump administration for creating a vaccine, but I don't think it helps when a candidate for office says, well, if it's made during the Trump administration, I'm not going to take it. That didn't help build public confidence in what was going on. When we talk about say something safe, the honest discussion you have with your patient is, we think this helps, and here's why. But also honest is, I don't know what I'll say 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And here are some of the adverse events that we are seeing. And you have a discussion with your patient and you decide what's best for you. Look, many people got COVID. They got infection-acquired immunity. It's not necessarily that they didn't want to get the vaccine. It's because it wasn't available to them. And there's a lot of information we could have gained from those people that got COVID and how their body responded to it. Some didn't even know they got COVID. Some people got tested or checked for antibodies and found out, oh, I must have had it. I don't know when. This is all important information and data. And it's very important. And you know what? You're not supposed to hear from Dr. Facebook or Dr. Social Media. You're supposed to talk to you, Dr. Tan, you, Dr. McCary, you, Doctor. That's who people need to go talk to. And we have to supply doctors with accurate data without flawed studies. That's the important thing. That's one of the takeaways that we need to come away with from this committee. One thing I never heard about, and I've never heard anyone discuss or studying, the possibility of hyperimmunity. You've had COVID, you've had the vaccine, you get the booster. What are the effects of that? Those are fair questions. Hyperimmunity is real. So I hope that we can continue to go down this path and have good conversations with experts and amongst ourselves to where we can really have some good results and good recommendations to make for the future. With that, And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there's no further business, without objection, the Select Subcommittee stands adjourned.